It was a regular Tuesday evening when James pulled into his driveway. The sun had just started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He loosened his tie as he stepped out of his car, feeling the weight of another long day at the office. His briefcase felt heavier than usual, packed with documents he'd need to review before tomorrow's hearing. James was 42 years old and had worked hard to get where he was. He'd spent years in law school, worked countless late nights, and finally made it as a federal prosecutor. His job wasn't easy, but he took pride in it. He was good at what he did, and he knew it. More importantly, he was making a difference in his community. The neighborhood was quiet that evening. A few kids were riding their bikes down the street, and he could hear someone mowing their lawn a few houses down. This was the kind of peace he'd worked so hard to achieve. A safe neighborhood, a comfortable home, a place where his family could feel secure. He'd chosen this area specifically because it was calm and family-friendly. As he walked toward his front door, keys jingling in his hand, he noticed a police car slowly cruising down the street. He didn't think much of it at first. Police patrols were normal in suburban neighborhoods. They kept everyone safe. He gave a small nod in that direction, the way neighbors do, and continued toward his door. But something felt off. The patrol car wasn't just passing through. It was slowing down. Then it stopped, right in front of his house. James paused, his hand on the doorknob, and turned around. The officer inside was staring directly at him. Not the casual glance of a patrol officer checking the area. This was different. This was focused, intense. James felt a small knot forming in his stomach. He'd prosecuted enough cases to know body language, to read situations. And this situation was starting to feel wrong. He watched as the car door opened and a uniformed officer stepped out. The officer was tall, broad-shouldered, probably in his late 40s. His hand rested on his belt close to his weapon. James forced a smile, trying to ease whatever tension was building. Maybe the officer was just being cautious. Maybe there had been some reports of break-ins in the area that he didn't know about. He was willing to give the benefit of the doubt. After all, police officers had tough jobs. They dealt with danger every day. The officer walked toward him with purposeful steps. There was no smile, no friendly greeting. Just a stern expression and eyes that seemed to have already made up their mind about something. James kept his hand on his keys, visible, non-threatening. He knew the rules. He knew how these encounters could go wrong if someone made the wrong move. His house stood behind him, a modest 2-story home with a small garden his wife had planted last spring. Through the window he could see the family photos on the mantel, the warm glow of the lamp in the living room, his home, his sanctuary, the place where he should feel safest in the world. But right now, standing on his own porch with an officer approaching him with suspicion written all over his face, James felt anything but safe. He felt like he was about to become a statistic. Another story, another headline. And all he'd done was come home from work. The officer was getting closer now, and James could see the name tag on his uniform, Officer Brennan. James made a mental note of it, a habit from his years in law. Always remember names. Always remember details. They matter in court, and something told him they might matter here too. His wife Rachel was inside preparing dinner. His son Daniel was probably upstairs doing homework. They had no idea what was unfolding outside their front door. They had no idea that their ordinary Tuesday evening was about to turn into something none of them would ever forget. James took a deep breath and waited. He'd done nothing wrong. He was standing at his own front door, holding his own keys, about to enter his own home. Surely this would be cleared up in seconds. Surely the officer would ask a simple question. James would answer, and they'd both laugh about the misunderstanding. But as Officer Brennan got within 10 feet of him, James saw the look in his eyes. And in that moment he knew, this wasn't going to be simple. This wasn't going to be quick. And this definitely wasn't going to end with laughter. Something about the officer's expression, the set of his jaw, the way his hand stayed close to his weapon, told James that this man had already decided who James was and what he was doing here. And the decision wasn't good. The officer's eyes held suspicion, prejudice, and a dangerous certainty that he was right. James felt his heart rate increase. His legal mind started racing through scenarios, procedures, rights. But another part of him, the part that was just a man trying to enter his own home, felt something else entirely. Fear. Real, genuine fear. because he knew that no matter how educated he was, no matter what position he held, no matter how innocent he was in this moment, none of that might matter in the next few minutes. He was a black man standing outside a house, and an officer had decided he didn't belong there. The keys in his hand suddenly felt like evidence of a crime he hadn't committed. His briefcase felt suspicious instead of professional. His own front door felt like a barrier he had no right to cross, and all because of one officer's assumptions. One man's biases, one person's inability to see him as anything other than a threat. James straightened his shoulders and prepared himself for whatever was coming next. He'd faced hostile witnesses, aggressive defense attorneys, and dangerous criminals in courtrooms. But somehow, standing on his own porch, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had in his professional life. Because in the courtroom there were rules, there were procedures, there were checks and balances. Out here on this quiet suburban street in front of his own home, there was just him and an officer who'd already made up his mind. Officer Brennan's voice cut through the evening air like a knife.
"Hey, stop right there."
The command was sharp, aggressive, leaving no room for confusion. James froze, his key halfway to the lock. He turned slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. Years of courtroom experience had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. This was personal in a way no trial had ever been. "Can I help you, officer?" James asked, keeping his voice steady and respectful. He'd learned long ago that tone mattered in these situations. One wrong word, one hint of attitude, and things could spiral out of control fast. He'd seen it happen to others. He'd prosecuted cases where encounters like this had ended in tragedy. Brennan took a few more steps forward, his boots heavy on the concrete walkway. "What are you doing here?" The question came out more like an accusation than an inquiry. There was no courtesy in it, no professional distance, just raw suspicion. James blinked, confused by the question. I'm entering my home, officer. I live here." He gestured toward the door behind him, toward the house that had his name on the mortgage, his furniture inside, his family's belongings scattered throughout. It seemed so obvious that he almost felt ridiculous stating it, but Brennan's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. "Your home?" The disbelief in his voice was clear. He looked James up and down, then glanced at the house as if trying to match the two things together in his mind and finding it impossible. "I'm going to need to see some identification." James felt a flash of frustration but pushed it down. This was routine, he told himself. Police officers asked for ID all the time. It was part of their job. Even though he'd done nothing wrong, even though he was standing at his own front door, he'd comply. He'd show his ID, this would get cleared up, and he could finally go inside and have dinner with his family. "Of course, officer. My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now, okay?" James announced his movements clearly, something he'd never thought he'd have to do at his own home. He slowly moved his hand toward his back pocket, making sure every motion was visible and non-threatening. But before his hand could even touch his wallet, Brennan's hand shot to his weapon. "I said don't move!" The officer's voice had risen, taking on an edge of panic mixed with aggression. In 2 quick strides, he closed the distance between them and grabbed James's arm with surprising force. Everything happened so fast after that. James felt his arm being twisted behind his back. He felt the rough brick of his house against his cheek as Brennan shoved him against the wall. He heard his briefcase hit the ground with a thud. He felt the cold metal of handcuffs clicking around his wrists, biting into his skin. "Officer, please. There's been a misunderstanding," James tried to explain, his voice strained from the awkward position. "I'm a federal prosecutor. My identification is in my wallet. My family is inside. Just check." "Save it," Brennan cut him off. "I've heard every story in the book. You people always have some excuse." The word stung worse than the handcuffs. You people. Those 2 words told James everything he needed to know about what was really happening here. This wasn't about procedure. This wasn't about safety. This was about something much older, much deeper, and much more dangerous. The front door burst open behind them. "James, what's going on?" "What are you doing to my husband?" Rachel stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She'd been washing vegetables at the sink when she'd heard the commotion. At first, she'd thought maybe James had dropped something. Then she'd heard the raised voices. "Ma'am, step back inside," Brennan ordered without even looking at her. He was busy securing James's hands, checking the cuffs twice to make sure they were tight. Too tight. James could feel his fingers starting to tingle from restricted blood flow. Step back. That's my husband. He lives here. We live here. Rachel's voice was rising, a mix of anger and panic. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. I'm calling someone. This is wrong. This is so wrong. Brennan finally looked at her, his expression showing no sympathy. Ma'am, I'm investigating a possible burglary. If you don't step back inside, I'll have to consider you an obstruction to my investigation. The threat was clear. Comply or face arrest yourself. Neighbors were starting to notice now. Mrs. Chen from next door had come out to water her plants and stood frozen, hose in hand, watching the scene unfold. The teenagers across the street had stopped shooting hoops and were recording on their phones. Old Mr. Patterson from 2 houses down was walking over, confusion written all over his face. James felt the humiliation washing over him. Here he was, a respected federal prosecutor, handcuffed on his own porch like a criminal, his neighbors watching, his wife terrified, all because he'd come home from work. All because an officer had looked at him and seen a threat instead of a man with keys to his own door. Officer Brennan. James tried again, forcing himself to stay calm even though every fiber of his being wanted to yell, to rage against the injustice of this moment. Please just look at my ID, call the U.S. Attorney's Office. Call anyone. This is all a terrible mistake. But Brennan was already on his radio calling for backup. This is Unit 12. I've got a suspicious individual in custody. Possible burglary in progress. Send additional units to my location. He gave the address, James's address, and signed off. Rachel disappeared back inside the house, her phone pressed to her ear. Through the window, James could see his son Daniel's face appear at the top of the stairs, pale and frightened. The boy was 16, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to be terrified by it. More police cars would be arriving soon. This situation, already bad, was about to get worse. James's mind raced through possibilities. He thought about resisting, about demanding his rights more forcefully. But he knew better. He'd seen too many cases where things had escalated, where someone had talked back, had moved wrong, had done anything that an officer could interpret as threatening. So he stood there, face against his own front door, handcuffed on his own property, and did the only thing he could do. He stayed calm. He stayed quiet. And he prayed that this nightmare would end before something irreversible happened. Before his son had to watch his father be taken away in handcuffs. Before his career, his reputation, his entire life was damaged by one officer's inability to see past the color of his skin. The evening air that had seemed so peaceful just minutes ago now felt oppressive. The sounds of the neighborhood, kids playing, lawnmowers humming, birds singing, all seemed impossibly distant, like they belonged to a different world. A world where men could come home from work without being treated like criminals. A world James had thought he lived in. But standing there, handcuffed and helpless, he realized that world had never really existed for him. He'd just been lucky enough to avoid this reality until now. The siren started about 3 minutes later. That piercing wail that usually meant help was coming, but today meant something entirely different. 2 more patrol cars pulled onto the street, their blue and red lights painting everything in harsh, alternating colors. James felt his heart sink further with each arriving vehicle. This was supposed to be getting cleared up by now. Instead, it was growing into something bigger, something more dangerous. 4 more officers emerged from the vehicles, hands on their belts, surveying the scene with practiced eyes. They walked up to Brennan, who still had James pressed against the wall, and started asking questions in low voices. James caught fragments of the conversation. Homeowner says he lives here. Found him trying to enter. Wouldn't cooperate. Called for backup. Every word was a distortion of the truth. James hadn't tried to enter, he was entering. He hadn't refused to cooperate. He'd been attacked before he could even show his ID. But the narrative was already being written, and he wasn't the one holding the pen. The neighborhood had transformed from a quiet suburban street into a crime scene. Yellow tape wasn't up yet, but it might as well have been. Every neighbor was outside now, some standing on their porches, others clustered in small groups on the sidewalk. Phone cameras were everywhere, recording everything. In the age of social media, this would be online within minutes. Rachel had come back outside, and this time she'd brought their next-door neighbor, Patricia. a retired teacher who'd lived on this street for 30 years. Patricia marched right up to the officers, her voice firm despite her age. I don't know what you think is happening here, but that man is James Thompson. He and his wife have lived here for 7 years. He's a lawyer or something, works for the government. You've got this all wrong. One of the newer officers, younger than Brennan, seemed to hesitate. He glanced at James, then back at Patricia. Ma'am, we're just doing our job. We received a call. A call about what? Patricia interrupted. About a man entering his own home? About someone who's lived here longer than some of you have been on the force? Her indignation was clear, and for a moment James felt a surge of hope. Maybe reason would prevail. Maybe someone would listen, but Brennan stepped forward, his jaw set. Officers, this is my scene. I've got it under control. The emphasis on my made it clear he wasn't backing down. His pride was invested now. To admit he was wrong would mean admitting he'd assaulted an innocent man, violated his rights, and created this entire mess based on nothing but his own prejudice. Inside the house, Rachel was on the phone with someone from James's office. Her voice carried through the open door, frantic and desperate. You don't understand, they've handcuffed him. On our porch! They won't listen to anything we say. She was talking to Tom Chen, one of James's closest colleagues and an FBI agent. Tom had worked with James on several major cases. They'd become friends over the years, had dinner together with their families, celebrated victories and commiserated over losses. Tom's voice came through the phone, urgent and commanding even from a distance. Rachel, listen to me very carefully. Don't let them take him anywhere. Keep recording everything. I'm making some calls right now. This is going to get resolved, but I need you to stay strong. Can you do that? Rachel nodded even though Tom couldn't see her, wiping tears from her eyes. Yes, okay. Please hurry. Meanwhile, on the porch, James was trying once more to explain himself to the gathered officers. His voice was hoarse now, strained from the awkward position and the stress. Gentlemen, please. My name is James Thompson. I'm a senior federal prosecutor with the Eastern District. My badge is in my briefcase right there on the ground. My identification is in my wallet in my back pocket. My wife is inside. My son is inside. We've lived here for 7 years. Just check. Please, just check. The younger officer bent down toward the briefcase, but Brennan stopped him with a sharp gesture. Don't touch anything. That's potential evidence. Evidence of what? James wanted to scream. Evidence that I carry a briefcase to work? Evidence that I own keys to my own house? From the upstairs window, Daniel was recording everything on his phone. His hands shaking so badly the footage would be shaky. But it would be evidence. Real evidence. Not the twisted kind Brennan was trying to create, but actual documentation of what was really happening. The boy had remembered the talks his parents had given him about staying safe during police encounters, about recording when possible, about never making sudden movements. Talks that black families have with their children, talks that shouldn't be necessary but are. Mr. Patterson, the elderly neighbor, had made his way closer to the group of officers. He was white, in his 70s, a veteran who'd lived on this street since the houses were first built. His voice carried weight in the neighborhood, and he knew it. Officers, I've known the Thompson family since they moved in. James is a good man. Works hard, takes care of his family, keeps his lawn nice. Whatever you think is happening here, you're wrong. That man is exactly where he belongs. But even Mr. Patterson's testimony wasn't enough. Brennan had dug in his heels. Sir, I appreciate your input, but I need everyone to step back. This is an active investigation, and you're all interfering with police business. Police business? Mr. Patterson's voice rose, something it rarely did. The only business here is a man trying to enter his own home. I've seen this before, you know. Back in the 60s. Thought we'd moved past this kind of thing, but I guess some people never learn. The tension on the street was thick enough to cut. Neighbors were getting agitated. Some were on their phones, calling friends, calling lawyers, calling anyone who might help. Others were arguing with the officers, demanding they check James's identity, demanding they release him. A few were just standing there, shocked and helpless, watching an injustice unfold in real time. Rachel had gone back inside to try to keep Daniel upstairs, to shield him from the worst of this, but the boy refused to leave his post at the window. He needed to see this. He needed to record this. Even at 16, he understood that what was happening to his father could happen to him someday. This was a lesson he hadn't asked for but was learning anyway. James's shoulders were starting to ache from the position. His wrists were going numb from the too tight handcuffs, and his face hurt from being pressed against the brick wall, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight of this moment. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of his family and neighbors. The anger at a system that could allow this to happen. The fear of what might come next. Because in the back of his mind, James knew something else. Something that made this situation even more dangerous than it appeared. He wasn't just a federal prosecutor. He was the lead attorney on one of the biggest cases the district had seen in years. A massive corruption and drug trafficking case involving dangerous people. People who'd already made threats. People who'd want nothing more than to see him compromised, discredited, or worse. His address was in federal databases. It was flagged, protected. Any incident at his home was supposed to trigger specific protocols. But those protocols assumed the threat would come from criminals, not from the people sworn to protect citizens. As more officers arrived and the situation continued to escalate, James wondered if anyone at the federal level knew what was happening yet. If the flags had been triggered, if help was coming, or if he was on his own, at the mercy of Officer Brennan's pride and prejudice, with nothing but his faith in a system that seemed to be failing him spectacularly in this moment. Tom Chen's phone call with Rachel lasted exactly 47 seconds. That was all the time he needed to understand the severity of what was happening. As an FBI special agent with 15 years of experience, Tom had developed instincts about situations like this. And every single one of those instincts was now screaming at him that this was about to become a major incident. He hung up with Rachel and immediately dialed another number, one that went directly to the FBI field office. The person who answered was Special Agent Linda Martinez, the night shift supervisor. Tom didn't waste time with pleasantries. Linda, this is Tom Chen. I need you to pull up the address database right now and search for James Thompson's home address. His voice was tight, controlled, but urgent. He was already grabbing his jacket and badge, heading for the door of his apartment. There was typing on the other end, then a pause. Then Linda's voice came back, different now, more serious. Tom, this address is flagged red. Federal protection status. Why are you? Because local PD has him in handcuffs on his own porch right now. They think he's a burglar. Tom was running down the stairs of his building now, not waiting for the elevator. How fast can we get a team there? Another pause, longer this time. Tom could hear more typing, could hear Linda talking to someone else in the background. When she came back on the line, her voice had shifted into command mode. We're mobilizing now. I'm pulling the rapid response team. They can be on site in 12 to 15 minutes. Tom, you need to understand something. This address isn't just flagged for protection. It's flagged because of the Valdez case. If there's any incident at this location, protocol requires— I know the protocol, Tom interrupted, pushing through the exit door and sprinting toward his car. That's why I'm calling. This isn't a threat from Valdez's people. This is a threat from the people who are supposed to be protecting him. Local cop got it in his head that James doesn't belong in his own house. The silence on the other end told Tom that Linda understood exactly what that meant. They both knew what happened when prejudice mixed with authority. They'd both investigated cases where things had gone terribly, fatally wrong. Neither of them wanted to add James's name to that list. I'm dispatching everything we've got, Linda said finally. And Tom? I'm calling the Marshal Service too. If this address is compromised, we need to treat it as a potential security breach. Full response. Tom started his engine, already pulling out of the parking lot. Do it, and Linda? Make sure they know to go heavy. Local PD needs to understand they've made a massive mistake here. The bigger the federal presence, the faster they'll back down. While Tom was racing across the city, another series of calls was taking place at the FBI field office. Linda had activated the rapid response team, 6 agents who were trained for high-risk situations. But she was also making calls up the chain of command, because what was happening at James's house wasn't just about one man being wrongfully detained. It was about the integrity of an ongoing federal investigation. The Valdez case was huge. Miguel Valdez ran a drug trafficking operation that stretched across 3 states. His organization had connections to corrupt officials, dirty cops, and violent enforcers. James had been building this case for 18 months, and they were close to bringing down the entire network. If Valdez's people thought James was vulnerable, if they saw him being treated like a criminal by local police, it could embolden them. It could compromise the entire investigation. Deputy Director Harris took Linda's call in his home office, where he'd been reviewing case files for the next day. When she explained the situation, there was a long moment of silence. "Then tell me you're not serious when I wish I wasn't, sir, but we've got confirmed reports that local PD has detained James Thompson at his residence. The officer on scene is refusing to verify his identity." Harris stood up from his desk, already reaching for his secure phone. "Get every available unit to that location. I want a perimeter established. I want that street locked down. And I want someone from the Marshal Service there to explain to these local cops exactly how badly they've screwed up." "Already in motion, sir." "Good. And Linda, document everything. Every call, every response time, every decision. When this is over, when James is safe and sound, there's going to be a reckoning with that police department. I want every piece of evidence showing exactly how fast we responded and exactly how slow they were to listen to reason." At the U.S. Marshal Service, similar conversations were happening. When they received the call about a federal prosecutor under potential threat, their protocols kicked in immediately. It didn't matter that the threat was coming from local law enforcement, rather than from criminals. A threat was a threat, and federal officials were protected regardless of the source. Marshal Frank Williams had worked in protective services for 20 years. He'd guarded judges, witnesses, and prosecutors through some of the most dangerous trials in the country. But this situation was new even for him. "Let me get this straight," he said into his phone. "A local cop arrested one of our prosecutors at his own house because he didn't believe he lived there?" "That's the situation, sir." Frank felt anger rising in his chest. "Mobilize Delta Team. Full tactical response. I want that prosecutor protected. And I want those local officers to understand that they just committed a federal offense. Interfering with a federal official in the performance of their duties, potential civil rights violations, and depending on how this goes down, possible assault charges." Back on the street, Rachel had no idea that across the city multiple federal agencies were mobilizing. She only knew that Tom had told her to hold on. That help was coming. She stood in her doorway, filming everything on her phone, her hand still shaking but her resolve firm. Patricia stood beside her now, also filming, making sure there were multiple angles of what was happening. James, still handcuffed against his front door, was running through his own mental calculations. He knew his office would respond to something like this. He knew Tom would make calls, but he had no idea how fast or how extensive that response would be. He couldn't know that in FBI field offices and Marshal Service headquarters, his situation had been elevated to a Priority 1 incident. He couldn't know that multiple teams were being mobilized, that helicopters were being prepped, that what was happening on his quiet suburban street was about to become a major federal operation. All he knew was that his wrists hurt. His face hurt, and Officer Brennan was still standing behind him, still refusing to listen to reason, still convinced that he'd caught a criminal despite all evidence to the contrary. What James didn't know, what none of the local officers standing around knew, was that their quiet Tuesday evening was about to be interrupted by the full force of federal law enforcement. And when that force arrived, when black SUVs and tactical vehicles surrounded the block, when agents in FBI jackets established a perimeter and took control of the scene, Officer Brennan was going to realize just how catastrophically he'd misjudged the situation. The response was coming. It was already in motion. And in about 10 minutes, this suburban street was going to look like something out of a movie. Because when you wrongfully arrest a federal prosecutor who's under federal protection, working on a case involving dangerous criminals, the response isn't measured. It isn't subtle. It's overwhelming, and it was already on its way. The first sign that something had changed came from above, a deep rhythmic thumping sound that started faint and grew louder with each passing second, helicopter blades cutting through the evening air. Everyone on the street looked up, confused. Helicopters didn't usually fly over suburban neighborhoods, especially not this low. Officer Brennan heard it too, and for the first time since this situation started, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He looked up at the sky, then back at his fellow officers who were all doing the same thing. The younger officer who had wanted to check James's briefcase earlier looked genuinely concerned now. "Sir, what's going on?" Before Brennan could answer, someone shouted from down the street. "What the hell?" A neighbor was pointing at the end of the block where a large black SUV had just turned the corner. But it wasn't alone. Behind it came another, and another. and 2 more after that. 5 black SUVs moving with purpose, their windows tinted dark, their presence unmistakably official. The vehicles didn't park. They took positions, blocking off both ends of the street with precise efficiency. Men and women emerged from them, wearing dark tactical gear with 3 bright yellow letters on their backs. FBI. They moved like a well-trained unit, establishing a perimeter, speaking into radios. Their faces serious and focused. James, still handcuffed, felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made his knees weak. He recognized this kind of response. He'd seen it before in his work. This was federal law enforcement doing what they did best, taking control of a situation with overwhelming force and precision. Brennan's hand went to his radio, but before he could speak, more vehicles arrived. These weren't FBI. They were U.S. Marshal Service vehicles, unmarked but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. More agents emerged, these ones with U.S. Marshal emblazoned across their gear. They immediately began coordinating with the FBI agents, establishing a larger perimeter, directing traffic, keeping civilians at a safe distance. The neighborhood had gone from crime scene to full federal operation in the span of about 90 seconds. Neighbors who'd been standing on their lawns were now being politely but firmly moved back behind a perimeter line. The teenagers who'd been recording on their phones were still recording, but now from much farther away. The helicopter overhead wasn't just flying by, it was circling, providing overwatch. One of the local officers, the youngest one, whispered to his partner, "What did we just walk into?" The partner just shook his head, looking pale. They were all starting to realize that this wasn't a simple case of mistaken identity. This was something much bigger. A black sedan pulled up, different from the SUVs. More official somehow, with government plates that even the local cops could recognize. Tom Chen stepped out, his FBI credentials already in hand, his expression thunderous. He'd made it here in record time, pushing every speed limit and running 2 red lights along the way. He walked straight toward the cluster of officers around James, his badge held high. "FBI Special Agent Tom Chen, release that man immediately." His voice carried authority, the kind that came from years of command experience and absolute certainty that he was right. Behind him, the tactical team had finished establishing their perimeter and were now focused on the officers surrounding James. Brennan finally found his voice. "Agent, this is a local matter. We received a call about—" "I don't care what call you received." Tom cut him off, his voice hard as steel. "That man you have in handcuffs is James Thompson, senior federal prosecutor for the Eastern District. He's under federal protection, and his address is flagged in every law enforcement database in this region. You should have verified his identity before you laid a hand on him." The color drained from Brennan's face. Around him, the other local officers took small, unconscious steps backward, distancing themselves from what was clearly about to become Brennan's problem. "Not theirs," Tom continued. Moving closer now, his eyes locked on Brennan. "But you didn't verify, did you? You saw a black man entering a house in a nice neighborhood and decided he must be a criminal. So you assaulted a federal official, violated his civil rights, and in the process, potentially compromised an ongoing federal investigation into a dangerous criminal organization." Each word was like a hammer blow. The other local officers were now clearly trying to disappear, looking anywhere but at Brennan or Tom. They knew they were witnessing a career ending in real time, and nobody wanted to be associated with it. I didn't know," Brennan stammered, but even as he said it, he knew how weak it sounded. Not knowing wasn't an excuse. Checking should have been the first thing he did. Would have been the first thing he did if James had been white. Tom walked past Brennan directly to James. "Hey, brother, let's get you out of these," he said, his voice softening for the first time. He pulled out a handcuff key. FBI agents carried them for situations exactly like this, and carefully removed the cuffs from James's wrists. The metal had left red marks, indentations in the skin that would probably bruise. James turned around slowly, rubbing his wrists. He looked at Tom, and for a moment neither man spoke. Then Tom put a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" James nodded, not trusting his voice yet. The relief, the anger, the humiliation, the gratitude, it was all mixing together, overwhelming him. More federal vehicles were still arriving. The street was now completely blocked off at both ends. A mobile command center was being set up in one of the larger vehicles. Federal agents were interviewing neighbors, collecting statements, documenting everything. This had gone from a local police matter to a federal incident, and the thoroughness of the response reflected that. Marshal Frank Williams arrived in the mobile command center, a large RV-style vehicle equipped with communications gear and workstations. He climbed out and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd handled countless high-risk situations. But even he looked somewhat impressed by the scale of the response. When a federal prosecutor under active protection was threatened, every available resource got deployed. Rachel had run from the house the moment she saw the handcuffs come off. She threw her arms around James, tears streaming down her face. "Oh God, oh thank God," she kept repeating. Behind her, Daniel had finally come downstairs and was standing in the doorway, his phone still in his hand, still recording. His face showed a mix of relief and trauma. This was a night he'd never forget. Lessons he'd learned that no teenager should have to learn. Patricia, the retired teacher neighbor, was giving a statement to an FBI agent, her voice indignant and clear. "That officer," she pointed at Brennan, "decided that man was a criminal before he even got out of his car. I watched the whole thing. It was racial profiling, plain and simple, and every officer who showed up after him just went along with it." The FBI agent taking her statement nodded, writing everything down. There would be reports, lots of reports. This incident would be documented 6 ways from Sunday, and every detail would matter. Tom approached the group of local officers, his face all business now. "Which one of you is the supervising officer?" When Brennan raised his hand reluctantly, Tom shook his head. "Not anymore." "You're relieved. One of the other officers is in charge now. You're going to wait right here until Internal Affairs arrives. And trust me, they're on their way." The helicopter continued its circle overhead, its spotlight occasionally sweeping across the street. To the neighbors watching from behind the perimeter, it looked like something out of a movie or a TV show. Federal agents everywhere, vehicles blocking the streets, a helicopter overhead, all for one man who'd been trying to enter his own home. But to the federal agents on the scene, this was standard protocol. When one of their own was threatened, when a high-value prosecutor was put at risk, the response was swift, overwhelming, and decisive. It sent a message to both the criminals they prosecuted and to anyone else who might threaten federal officials. Mess with one, and you mess with all of them. As the evening darkened into night, the lights from all the vehicles turned the street into day. James stood with Tom, Rachel beside him, watching as his quiet neighborhood transformed into a federal crime scene. He felt Rachel's hand in his, felt her trembling slightly. He squeezed back, letting her know he was here, he was okay, they were safe. But even as he stood there, surrounded by federal protection, part of him knew that this night would change things. For him, for his family, for everyone who'd witnessed it. Because in those moments when he'd been handcuffed on his own porch, treated like a criminal in front of his neighbors and his son, something had broken. Some sense of safety, some belief in justice, some faith that his position and his education would protect him from the prejudice that too many others faced every day. The federal response was impressive. It was overwhelming. It was everything it should have been. But it had come after the damage was done. After the humiliation, after his 16-year-old son had watched his father be treated like a threat for the crime of coming home from work. And no amount of federal agents, no matter how many vehicles or helicopters or statements taken, could undo that. Inside the mobile command center, Tom sat across from Officer Brennan. The space was cramped, filled with communication equipment and monitors showing various angles of the street from the helicopter overhead and from cameras the FBI had set up. Another agent stood near the door taking notes. This was an official interview and everyone in the vehicle knew it. Brennan looked smaller somehow sitting in that chair. The swagger and certainty from earlier had evaporated, replaced by the slow dawning realization of just how badly he'd messed up. His hands were clasped in his lap, and he couldn't seem to meet Tom's eyes. Tom leaned forward, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made it clear this wasn't a friendly conversation. "Do you know who James Thompson is, Officer Brennan?" Brennan shook his head slightly. "He said he was a prosecutor, but I thought..." "You thought he was lying," Tom finished for him. "Because why would a federal prosecutor live in that nice house in that nice neighborhood, right?" The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable. "Let me educate you, officer. James Thompson isn't just any prosecutor. He's the senior federal prosecutor for the Eastern District. He's been with the office for 12 years. He's prosecuted over 100 cases with a conviction rate above 90%. Brennan was starting to look sick, but Tom wasn't done. Not by a long shot. You've heard of the Valdez case, I assume? It's been all over the news for the past year. Tom pulled out a tablet, pulled up a news article, and turned it so Brennan could see the headline, "Major Drug Trafficking Organization Under Federal Investigation." Below it was a picture of James standing on the courthouse steps, briefcase in hand, looking professional and confident. Brennan's face went even paler. That's the biggest case in the region. Everyone knows about it. Everyone except you, apparently, Tom said coldly. James Thompson is the lead prosecutor on that case. He spent 18 months building it. He's gotten death threats, multiple threats, which is why his home address is flagged in every law enforcement database as a federal protection site. When you ran his address, and you did run it, didn't you? That information should have popped up immediately. I didn't run the address, Brennan admitted quietly. I saw him and I thought, you thought what? Tom's voice rose slightly. You thought a black man couldn't possibly live in that house? Couldn't possibly be successful enough, educated enough, accomplished enough to own property in that neighborhood? He paused, letting the words hang in the air. So you didn't check. You didn't verify. You just made assumptions based on the color of his skin, and then you doubled down on those assumptions even when he told you who he was, even when his wife told you, even when the neighbors told you. The other agent by the door was writing everything down, documenting every word. This interview would become part of the official record, evidence in what was sure to be a long and complicated series of investigations and lawsuits. Tom continued, pulling up another document on his tablet. The Valdez organization has ties to corrupt officials, including law enforcement. They've already made attempts to intimidate James. There was an incident 6 months ago where someone followed his wife from the grocery store. Another time, someone spray-painted threats on his office parking space. We've been monitoring the situation closely, which is why his home has federal protection status. He looked directly at Brennan now, making sure the officer understood the full weight of what he'd done. So when you handcuffed James Thompson on his own porch, when you created this scene in front of his neighbors, in front of his teenage son, you didn't just violate his civil rights. You didn't just assault a federal official. You potentially gave the Valdez organization ammunition to use against him. They can point to this incident. They can claim he's not credible, that he's had problems with law enforcement himself. You might have damaged one of the most important prosecutions this district has seen in years. Brennan looked like he might be sick. His hands were shaking slightly. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know any of this. You didn't know because you didn't check, Tom said, his voice like ice. You didn't know because you saw what you expected to see rather than what was actually in front of you. And now, because of your prejudice, because of your assumptions, we've got a federal incident, a compromised prosecutor, and a community that just watched their neighbor get treated like a criminal for coming home from work. Outside the command center, other conversations were taking place. Marshal Frank Williams was briefing James on what would happen next. They were standing near James's house, far enough from the crowd of officers and agents to have some privacy, but close enough that Rachel could see them from the front door. We'll have agents stationed here for the next several days, Frank explained. Given that this incident is now public, and given your involvement in the Valdez case, we have to assume that this could create additional security concerns. We'll also be reviewing your office security, your travel routes, everything. James nodded, still processing everything. This was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday evening. I was supposed to have dinner with my family. Frank's expression softened slightly. He was a father himself, had teenage kids. He could imagine how he'd feel if they'd witnessed what Daniel had seen tonight. I know, and I'm sorry it happened. But James, you need to understand something. What happened tonight was wrong. Completely, unequivocally wrong. But the response you saw, the speed at which federal resources mobilized, that shows how seriously we take the protection of our prosecutors. That show of force wasn't just for you. It was a message to everyone watching, including Valdez's people if they're paying attention. Some message, James said quietly. My son just watched his father get handcuffed and treated like a criminal. What message does that send to him? Frank didn't have a good answer for that. Because James was right. No amount of federal response could undo the trauma of what Daniel had witnessed. Meanwhile, reporters were starting to arrive. Someone had heard the police scanner traffic about the federal response, and word had spread. News vans were trying to get close to the perimeter, cameras with long lenses pointed at the scene. The FBI agents weren't letting them through, but that wouldn't stop them from getting the story. Social media was already exploding with videos from neighbors, speculation about what was happening, hashtags starting to trend. One of the FBI's public affairs specialists had arrived and was setting up a statement. This kind of incident couldn't be swept under the rug. There were too many witnesses, too many recordings, too much federal involvement. The Bureau would need to get ahead of the narrative, explain what happened, and make it clear that Officer Brennan's actions were not acceptable to any law enforcement agency. Back in the command center, Tom was wrapping up his interview with Brennan. You're going to be suspended pending a full investigation. Internal affairs from your department is on the way. The FBI will be conducting its own investigation into potential civil rights violations. The Department of Justice will likely get involved, and James Thompson will almost certainly file a civil lawsuit. Your career as a police officer is effectively over. Brennan just sat there, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. He'd gotten up that morning as a police officer with 15 years of experience. He'd end the day as a cautionary tale about prejudice, assumptions, and the cost of not checking your biases at the door. One more thing, Tom said, standing up to leave. When you saw James Thompson standing at his own front door, you had a choice. You could have approached him respectfully, asked a few simple questions, verified his identity in 30 seconds, and gone on with your patrol. Instead, you saw a black man and decided he was a criminal. That choice, that split-second judgment based on nothing but the color of his skin, has led to all of this. He gestured at the command center, at the agents outside, at the federal response still unfolding. I hope it was worth it. Tom left the command center, leaving Brennan alone with his thoughts and the agent still taking notes. Outside, the scene was beginning to wind down slightly. The helicopter had moved off, though it was still in the area. Some of the vehicles were being repositioned. But the federal presence would remain for hours yet, documenting everything, interviewing everyone, building a case that would ensure this kind of thing couldn't be brushed aside or explained away. James stood on his porch with Rachel and Daniel, Tom beside them, watching it all unfold. The neighbors who'd defended him, who'd tried to help, were giving statements to FBI agents. The ones who'd just watched were being interviewed too. The recordings from phones would all become evidence. Every angle, every perspective, every witness account would be documented and preserved. It's going to be a long night, Tom said quietly, and probably a long few months. But James, we've got your back. The Bureau, the Marshal Service, the U.S. Attorney's Office, everyone. James looked at his friend, grateful for the support but still processing the trauma of the evening. Thanks, Tom, for coming so fast. For bringing everyone, He trailed off, not quite sure how to express what he was feeling. For doing our jobs, Tom finished, which is what Brennan should have done in the first place. He looked at Daniel, who was standing close to his mother, still pale and shaken. By the next morning, the incident had become national news. The video from Daniel's phone had been shared thousands of times overnight. Other angles from neighbors' phones added to the story. The headlines were everywhere. Federal prosecutor handcuffed at his own home. FBI responds to wrongful arrest of black prosecutor. Racial profiling incident triggers federal response. James sat at his kitchen table, coffee growing cold in front of him, scrolling through news articles on his tablet. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back on that porch, face against the brick, handcuffs cutting into his wrists. Rachel sat across from him, looking equally exhausted. Upstairs, Daniel was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. Neither parent was sure which. The phone had been ringing constantly since 6 in the morning. James's boss, the U.S. Attorney himself, had called to express support and outrage. Colleagues from across the country had reached out. His law school friends, former classmates, even professors from years ago had sent messages. The legal community was rallying around him, but that didn't make the experience any less painful. At the police department, Officer Brennan was in an interrogation room, much like the ones he'd used countless times in his career. But this time he was on the wrong side of the table. Internal Affairs had 2 investigators questioning him, documenting his statement, comparing it to the video evidence that had already emerged. His police union representative sat beside him, but there was only so much the union could do when the evidence was this clear, this public, and this damning. Walk me through your thought process, one of the IA investigators said, her voice neutral but her eyes hard. You pulled up to a residence and saw a man entering the home. What made you decide to approach him? Brennan shifted in his seat. In the cold light of morning, with his career disintegrating around him, the truth sounded even worse than it had felt at the time. I thought he looked suspicious. Suspicious how? What specific behaviors did you observe that indicated criminal activity? Silence, because there were no specific behaviors. There was just a black man in a nice neighborhood, and Brennan's prejudiced brain had filled in the rest. He'd created a narrative that didn't exist, seen a crime that wasn't happening, invented a threat that was never there. The investigation wasn't just internal to the police department. The FBI had opened a civil rights investigation, standard procedure when there were allegations of racially motivated misconduct by law enforcement. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had been notified and was reviewing the case to determine if federal charges were warranted. By noon, the police chief held a press conference. He stood at a podium, looking tired and frustrated, facing a room full of reporters with cameras and microphones. Behind him stood representatives from the mayor's office, the city council, and community leaders who'd been demanding answers since the story broke. Last night, one of our officers engaged in conduct that does not represent the values of this department or this community. The chief began, reading from a prepared statement. Officer Derek Brennan has been suspended without pay, pending the outcome of multiple investigations. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities, and we take these allegations extremely seriously. The reporters immediately started shouting questions. Chief, this isn't Officer Brennan's first complaint, is it? How many other complaints has he had?
Why was he still on the street with his history?
The chief looked uncomfortable, because those questions cut to the heart of the matter. Brennan's personnel file showed 8 previous complaints over his 15-year career. Most had been dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline. But now, with the spotlight on, all those previous complaints looked different. They looked like warning signs that had been ignored. Red flags that had been explained away. We are conducting a comprehensive review of Officer Brennan's entire service record, the chief continued. We are also reviewing the conduct of the other officers who were present at the scene. While Officer Brennan was the primary actor in this incident, other officers had opportunities to intervene and did not do so. That failure to act is also being investigated. At a federal building downtown, James was meeting with attorneys. His own attorney, a civil rights specialist named Victoria Hayes, sat beside him as they discussed strategy. Tom was there too, representing the FBI's interests, and a prosecutor from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had joined via video conference. We have grounds for a substantial civil rights lawsuit, Victoria explained, laying out documents on the conference table. False arrest, assault, violation of your Fourth Amendment rights, emotional distress, and given your position and the public nature of the incident, there's a strong argument for punitive damages. James nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. This isn't really about the money, you know. I mean, yes, I want accountability, but what I really want is to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Someone who doesn't have federal protection. Someone who doesn't have the FBI showing up to rescue them. Victoria smiled slightly. She'd represented many clients over the years, but the ones she respected most were the ones who understood that lawsuits could be about more than personal compensation. They could be about systemic change. Then we make that part of the settlement negotiations. We push for policy changes, mandatory training, revise procedures for verifying identity before making arrests. We make this incident expensive enough that they have no choice but to reform. The DOJ attorney on the screen nodded. From the federal side, we're looking at potential criminal charges against Officer Brennan. Deprivation of rights under color of law is a serious federal crime. We're also examining whether there's a pattern and practice of civil rights violations in that department that would justify a broader investigation. Social media had exploded with the story. The hashtag Justice for James was trending nationally. Civil rights organizations were holding rallies. Legal commentators were discussing the case on television. Everyone had an opinion, and most of those opinions were furious, but there were other voices too. Voices defending Brennan, saying he'd just been doing his job. Voices claiming James must have done something to provoke the response. Voices insisting that this was being blown out of proportion, that race had nothing to do with it. These voices were fewer, but they were loud, and they were determined. At a community meeting that evening, the local NELACP chapter held a forum to discuss the incident. The room was packed, standing room only, with concerned citizens who wanted answers and wanted change. Patricia, James's neighbor who'd tried to intervene, spoke passionately about what she'd witnessed. "I've lived in this community for 30 years, she said, her voice carrying across the crowded room. "I've watched it change, watched it grow. But last night I watched something I thought we'd left in the past. I watched a good man. A man who's done nothing but serve his community and his country, get treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. And I'm here to tell you that it's not acceptable. It never was and it never will be." The crowd applauded, but Patricia wasn't finished. And you know what the worst part was? It wasn't just one officer making a mistake. It was multiple officers going along with it. It was a system that allowed this to happen, that trained these officers to see threats where there were none, that failed to stop this from escalating when there were multiple opportunities to do so. Similar conversations were happening across the country. In law schools, professors were using the incident as a teaching moment about civil rights, police conduct, and the intersection of race and law enforcement. In police academies, instructors were discussing it as an example of what not to do, how biases could cloud judgment, how a failure to verify could lead to catastrophic consequences. 3 other officers who'd been present during James's arrest were facing disciplinary action. While they hadn't initiated the encounter, they'd stood by while Brennan violated James's rights. They'd heard James identify himself repeatedly, heard the neighbors vouch for him, seen the keys in his hand, and they'd done nothing. That failure to act was now being treated as serious as the initial action itself. The police union was fighting the suspensions and potential terminations, as unions do. But public opinion was heavily against them. The video evidence was too clear, the injustice too obvious, the response from federal authorities too definitive. This wasn't a case where there was room for interpretation or debate about what had happened. For James, the hardest part wasn't the investigations or the lawsuits or the media attention. It was watching his son process what had happened. Daniel had become quieter, more withdrawn. He'd stopped joking around like he used to. When Rachel asked him about it, he'd said something that broke both parents' hearts. "I always knew racism was real. But I thought maybe if you were successful enough, educated enough, respectable enough, it wouldn't matter. But it does matter, doesn't it? It always matters." That night, James sat in Daniel's room, something he hadn't done in years. His son was too old for bedtime talks, but this felt necessary. "What happened to me, what you witnessed, it was wrong," James said carefully. "It was a violation of everything that police officers are supposed to stand for. But Daniel, you need to understand some." 3 months later, James stood in his living room watching the evening news. The volume was low, but he could still hear the anchor discussing the case that had consumed his life since that Tuesday evening. Rachel sat beside him on the couch, her hand in his, while Daniel did homework at the dining room table. Though both parents suspected he was listening more than studying, the television screen showed footage of a courtroom. Officer Derek Brennan, looking diminished in civilian clothes rather than his uniform, sat beside his attorney as the judge read the verdict. Guilty on multiple counts, including deprivation of rights under color of law, assault, and filing a false report. The federal charges carried significant prison time, though sentencing wouldn't happen for another few weeks. But that was just the criminal case. The civil lawsuit that James had filed was still working its way through the courts, though settlement negotiations were ongoing. Victoria Hayes had been masterful in her approach, using the criminal conviction as leverage to push not just for monetary damages, but for the systematic reforms James really wanted. The police department had already implemented some changes. All officers were now required to verify identity before making arrests when possible. Body cameras, which had been optional before, were now mandatory for all patrol officers. The department had brought in outside consultants to conduct implicit bias training, real training, not just the box-checking exercise they'd done before. 3 officers, including Brennan, had been fired. 2 others received significant suspensions and were on probation. The police chief, facing pressure from the mayor and city council, had announced his retirement, though everyone knew it wasn't voluntary. A new chief was coming in from another city, someone with a strong track record on community relations and police reform. But policies and personnel changes, while important, couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't erase the memory of being handcuffed on his own porch, couldn't restore the sense of safety and security that James had lost that evening, couldn't give Daniel back his innocence about how the world worked. James had returned to work 2 weeks after the incident, though it had been difficult. His colleagues had been supportive, almost too supportive, treating him with a careful kindness that made him feel fragile. The Valdez case had continued, and James had thrown himself into it with renewed intensity. If anything good had come from the incident, it was a burning determination to see that case through, to prove that he couldn't be intimidated or derailed. The trial was set to begin in 2 months. Federal security around James had become routine now. He no longer noticed the agents who followed him to work, who checked his office each morning, who maintained a presence outside his home. It had become the new normal, though he hated that it had to be. At school, Daniel had struggled for a while. His grades had slipped, and he'd gotten into an argument with a teacher who'd made a comment about respecting police officers. It had taken several conversations with both his parents and with the school counselor to work through his anger and confusion. He was doing better now, but he was different, more serious, more aware, more cynical about systems and institutions. Rachel had perhaps been affected most of all, though she tried to hide it. She'd always been the optimistic one in the family, the one who believed in the best of people. But watching her husband be treated that way, seeing the fear and helplessness on their son's face, it had changed something in her. She'd thrown herself into advocacy work, joining the board of a local civil rights organization, speaking at community meetings, working to ensure that their experience led to real change. The neighborhood had changed too. Some neighbors, like Patricia and Mr. Patterson, had become closer friends, bonded by the shared experience of witnessing injustice and trying to fight it. But other neighbors had grown distant, uncomfortable with the federal presence, uncomfortable with the media attention, or perhaps uncomfortable with confronting their own assumptions and biases. Block parties were more awkward now. Small talk felt forced. James's phone buzzed with a text from Tom. Saw the verdict. Justice served. Drinks this weekend? James smiled and typed back, yeah, sounds good. Tom had checked in regularly over the past 3 months. More friend than colleague, making sure James was okay, making sure the federal protection was working. Just being there. The news segment ended, moving on to other stories, other injustices, other headlines. That was how it worked. The news cycle moved on. People's attention shifted, and what had been a national story became just another incident in the long history of racial profiling and police misconduct. But for James and his family, there was no moving on. There was only moving forward, carrying the weight of that experience with them. Later that evening, after Daniel had gone upstairs and Rachel was reading in bed, James sat alone in his home office. On his desk was a folder containing letters, hundreds of them that had arrived over the past 3 months. Letters from other families who'd experienced similar incidents. Letters from lawyers asking him to speak at conferences. Letters from advocacy organizations thanking him for pressing forward with the lawsuit. Letters from people sharing their own stories of being profiled, harassed, or mistreated by police. He'd answered as many as he could, though it was overwhelming. Each letter represented a person who'd been hurt, a family who'd been traumatized, a child who'd learned too young that the color of their skin could make them a target. The weight of all those stories, all that pain, it was almost too much to bear. But there were other letters too. Letters from police officers, good officers who were ashamed of what Brennan had done and who supported the reforms being implemented. Letters from people in law enforcement who understood that accountability made everyone safer, who knew that trust between police and communities was essential and had to be rebuilt through actions, not just words. Victoria Hayes had called earlier that day with an update on the settlement negotiations. The city was ready to offer a significant financial settlement, but more importantly, they were agreeing to most of the policy changes James had demanded. Independent oversight of the police department, regular audits of arrest records to identify patterns of bias, a citizen review board with real power, not just advisory capacity, mandatory de-escalation training, restrictions on when officers could draw weapons during routine encounters. It's not everything we asked for, Victoria had said, but it's substantial. It's real change, James, the kind that will make a difference. James had told her to proceed with the negotiations, but he'd also told her something else. Whatever money we get from the settlement, I want to establish a fund for families who've experienced similar incidents but don't have the resources to fight back. For legal aid, for counseling, for advocacy. I want something good to come from this. Now, sitting in his quiet office, James thought about that fund. He thought about the families it might help, the change it might create, the justice it might enable. It wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't undo what had happened to him. But it would mean that his experience, his trauma, his family's pain, would serve a purpose beyond just their own case. On the wall above his desk was Daniel's certificate from junior high graduation, a family photo from a vacation 2 years ago, his law degree, reminders of who he was, what he'd accomplished, the life he'd built. That evening, 3 months ago, standing handcuffed on his porch, he'd wondered if any of it mattered. If all his education, all his professional success, all his careful adherence to respectability, had been meaningless in the face of one officer's prejudice. He'd learned some hard truths that night. Success didn't protect you from racism. Education didn't prevent profiling. Even being a federal prosecutor couldn't stop someone from seeing you as a threat first and a person second. Those realizations had been painful, disillusioning even, but he'd also learned something else, that there were people willing to stand up for what was right. Neighbors like Patricia and Mr. Patterson who'd spoken up despite their discomfort, colleagues like Tom who'd mobilized an entire federal apparatus to protect him. A legal system that, while flawed and slow, could still deliver justice when pushed hard enough. A community of advocates and allies who understood that his fight was their fight too. The incident had become a catalyst. Local police departments across the state were reviewing their policies. Other prosecutors were coming forward with their own experiences of bias and mistreatment. Conversations about race and policing were happening in city councils, in police departments, in living rooms across the country. Change was slow, frustratingly slow, but it was happening. James closed the folder of letters and turned off his desk lamp. Tomorrow he'd be back in court, working on the Valdez case, doing the job he loved, serving justice the way he'd sworn to do. The federal security detail would follow him there, follow him home, a constant reminder that his life had changed in ways he couldn't undo. But as he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, passing Daniel's room where his son slept, he felt something beyond the anger and pain and frustration. He felt determination. What had happened to him was wrong, but it had happened in the light, witnessed and recorded and responded to. How many others had experienced the same thing in the darkness?